Okay, well, hello everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing our first invited speaker, Juan Eugenio Iglesias at the Martinos Center, Harvard Medical School, and also CSAIL at MIT. So he's going to be delivering a talk on generalizable machine learning for large-scale analysis of clinical and portable brain MRI in the wild. It's a long title. So just to briefly introduce Eugenio to those of you who haven't met him yet. So Juan Eugenio Iglesias, Eugenio for short, holds degrees in telecommunication and electrical engineering from the University of Seville and the Royal Institute of Technology, KTH. He obtained his PhD in biomedical engineering at the University of California, Los Angeles, sponsored by a Fulbright grant. He was a postdoctoral researcher at the Martinos Center for Biomedical Imaging and the Basque Center on Cognition, Brain, and Language, sponsored by a Marie Curie Fellowship. So in 2016, he joined University College London as junior faculty, funded by the starting grant of the ERC. In 2019, he rejoined the Martinos Center, where he is now associate professor. He also holds honorary appointments at the University College London and MIT. So let's give it up for Eugenio.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Sean. Greatly appreciated, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And this should be fun. I'm very excited about it. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. And you see, excellent. Alrighty, yeah. So it's a slightly long title. I acknowledge. Sean is right. And let's jump straight into it. So I'm going to start, this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to start motivating this work from the perspective of image segmentation to measure the volume of brain regions. I'm going to talk a little bit about the related work because, of course, we're not the only people working on these problems. Then I'm going to go over the solution that our group has been working on for the past couple of years, show some results in segmentation, and then jump onto other domains, including super resolution, synthesis, surface placement, and analysis of portable low field MR. So yeah, let's jump into it. So image segmentation, I don't think I need to show you guys this, right? We want to go from something like this on the left to a segmentation on the right. So labeling every pixel with the corresponding neuroanatomical label that matches the underlying anatomy of the brain, the underlying ROI. We can use this to measure, for example, the volume of structures by counting voxels labeled as a given ROI, and for many other analyses, right? Now, in research, we have the privilege of the lack of working with high-quality isotropic images like this pretty 1 millimeter MPRH that you see here. No matter if you slice it in sagittal, axial, or coronal direction, it's going to look pretty, right? But in the clinic, like 90%, if not 99% of MRIs in the world, or brain MRIs, they're acquired with different sequences. They are not isotropic. They have like fewer slices so that doctors don't have to go over like a zillion orientations and a zillion slices every time they have to review a case. So this T1-weighted image here doesn't look very different compared with an upstairs. But if I were to look at it from the side, from the orthogonal plane, it would look disgusting like this. No? Like you start seeing the big slice separation in sagittal view over the slices that were acquired in the axial plane. Ideally, what I would like to do, right, is to take this image and still get a segmentation that looks like the one upstairs at 1 millimeter isotropic in an ideal world, right? Now, to do that, there's a bunch of problems, right? But the number one problem is the variability in the appearance of the brain scans. So the first axis of variation is the MRI contrast, the MRI sequence. Some people would call it MRI modality, right? You could have, for example, a T1 weighted scan, like this one here, T2 weighted, proton density weighted, or even this deep brain stimulation type of sequence. But even within the type of contrast, the type of MRI modality, like you can have different flavors to it, right? Depending on the manufacturer of the scanner, the type of pulse sequence, the pulse sequence parameters, like you're going to have a lot of different flavors. In this case, in this example, within T1 weighted contrast, right? You can also have like different levels of pre-processing. Like sometimes for privacy reasons, we distribute school strip data, like this guy over here, right? Where you don't see the extracerebral tissue at all. And then the other axis of variation is resolution. I'm going to use resolution in a very loose way to refer to both the actual resolution and the direction of the acquisition. So even though I'm showing you sagittal planes here in the three cases, this image was acquired axially, which is like, it's why it looks ugly in the sagittal plane. This one is coronal, so it also looks ugly, but in a different way. So here you have like horizontal French fries, and here you have like vertical French fries, vertical rectangles. This one looks pretty because it was acquired sagittally, but if I was to look at it from the orthogonal plane, it would look ugly, right? There is the space between the slices. This is simulated, so it's the same brain at 3, 5, and 7 millimeter axial spacing. And then there is the thickness of the slices, which is similar, but not exactly the same. So the thickness is actually the amount of slice that contributed to the signal. So oftentimes it's the same as the spacing, but some other times, for example, you can have a spacing of 7 millimeters and a thickness of 5 millimeters, which means that you have 2 millimeter gaps in between, right? And thickness is normally a compromise between blurring and signal to noise ratio. The thicker the slice, the more signal you have, but also the more you blur. So you can probably see it here, right? With increasing thickness from left to right. It's subtle, but it's there. And of course, when you talk about resolution, for anybody who's worked with MRI in general or brain MRI, the long and winding road is the partial voluming. So if we have, for example, like this is assuming from a sagittal slice, and let's say like, okay, this was isotropic, but let's pretend that we had acquired it with a coronal acquisition like this one here at 5, this is 7 millimeter spacing. So what happens if I look, for example, at this pixel here, or these pixels here in plural on the left? Well, when I have a 7 millimeter slice, it becomes this blurry thing on the right. And for example, there, I'm mixing the white pixels or the white voxels from the white matter and the dark voxels from the CSF. And surprise, surprise, now it looks gray. And that's kind of bad because what also looks gray? Well, the gray matter, right? So this is creating like ambiguities that are really, really, really annoying. So in short, we have this ginormous mess, right? Where like we have a plethora of like different acquisitions, resolutions, and we would like to have a segmentation tool that can cope with the whole freaking thing, right? If you did that, right, you could go into the PACS of your hospital or any other hospital, download like tens of thousands of scans and analyze them retrospectively, rather than having to work only with pristine 1 millimeter data acquired prospectively. So you have like massive potential in terms of like effect sizes, sample sizes, and ability to detect differences, statistical power. But also, for example, we're very interested in this because we want to look at aging and Alzheimer's on minorities, for example. And like if you look at public data sets like AGNI or the UK Biobank, they're like 95% wide. But if you go into the PACS, you can, like mine tons of scans from minorities and build normative trajectories. And the other thing is that if you solve this problem, you're also, taking a solid step in the direction of quantitative morphometry in the clinic. Because even though 1 millimeter MP ranges are becoming increasingly available, they're still not widespread in clinical MRI. So the ability to extract, say, precise like quantitative volumes and measurements from the scans would be very valuable. So, like I said, of course, we're not the only ones doing this. And if you talk about image segmentation, the first thing that comes to mind is supervised convolutional neural networks, right? Supervised CNNs. Of course, nobody stops you. Like if you tell me like, hey, I want to segment like coronal MRIs like this guy over here. And I can, if you give me ground truth that is isotropic, I can train a CNN and that will work. And I can segment coronal T1s, that's fine. Of course, if now I try to segment axial T1s, it will, sorry, the other way around. The first one was axial, this one is coronal. It will blow up, right? This is not surprising. There is a domain gap. The network has never seen this resolution. It will blow up and fail miserably. That's fine. Let alone if you try to segment another MRI contrast, like a T2, right? So this is of course expected. That's fine. So something you could do, nobody stops you, is like training like a different network for every modality, right? You could do this. Of course, this requires supervised data for to train at every domain. And if you're very clever about it, and let's say you put together a training data set that is massively multimodal and high resolution isotropic, then you can simulate the low resolution and make the manual segmentations only once. You could probably still hack it, but it'd be incredibly difficult to deploy, right? Because like at test time, it's like, how do you know? Like, yeah, you can try to trust the DICOM header, but it's incredibly difficult to know a priori what model is going to work on what image. So it's incredibly impractical. Something else you can try is say, okay, let's say I have one network trained on T1s and or 1 millimeter T1s, and use domain adaptation. I could spend we could have a whole workshop on domain adaptation, but just to name two representative techniques and papers. The one on the left is unsupervised domain adaptation. So there is this paper by Yuan Kai Huo that I think is representative, and it uses CycleGAN, which you're probably familiar with. This paper that came out like 7 years ago, I think, where they were turning horses into zebras and photographs into Monet paintings and vice versa. And you play with this cycle consistency so that you can train with unpaired data. So you're saying, well, you give me a bunch of horses and I have a generator that turns horses into zebras, and I have a bunch of zebras and I have another generator that turns zebras into horses. When I go around the cycle, like my horse and my double fake horse, so you say horse, fake zebra, double fake horse, the horse and the double fake horse should be similar. Zebras and double fake zebras should be similar. And to prevent overfitting, you can have discriminators and say, hey, is this a real zebra or this is a zebra you made up? So you can play that game with MRI scans, right? So let's say you have a network trained for T1s, and now you say, hey, I wanted to work on T2s. So if I give you a bunch of T2s and you have a bunch of T1s, can you train a CycleGAN, make the T2s look like T1s, and then analyze them with your neural network? So that's something that you can do, but it's also not very practical in the sense that now when you have a new domain, you have the need for a bunch of like unlabeled scans. So it's not like you give me a scan, I don't know what it is like, and I can segment it, which is not great. That problem is solved by, at least partially, by test time adaptation. When you're like, okay, no, you give me one image now, and I'm gonna, again, this is just one paper, which I hope is representative. This is by Nirav Karani, who used to be at ETH. The idea is to say, well, during training, I have my T1s, and now I train my network, and I can segment them and get beautiful segmentations, right? What the ETH guys did was to say, well, I'm also going to train a denoising autoencoder that learns to go from ugly segmentations, like this one here, to corrected segmentations, like the one on the right. So what happens is that at test time, now you give me an image of a known contrast or a known resolution, let's say this T2 over here. I push it through my CNN, my segmentation CNN, and I get garbage, and that's okay, that's expected. But then the idea is that you push it through the denoising autoencoder, and in the beginning you will not get anything as clean as this, but like you get something cleaner than the input. And the idea is, okay, if I take the ground truth, now I fine-tune the weights of this network until I produce a segmentation that essentially it's a fixed point for the denoising autoencoder. So you're saying like, hey, keep turning the knobs in the CNN in these weights until what I get looks like something that the autoencoder recognizes as a good segmentation. So that actually works relatively well in many scenarios. I'm going to show you some results later. There's obviously many more, but again, we could have a whole workshop around this. And also, I really have to go over Bayesian segmentation for two reasons. One is that I made a living out of this for 10 years or maybe 5 years. This is a bit of a hipster segmentation technique. But at the same time, it's also the foundation of the work we've done after. So I'm going to quickly go over it. For the younger people in the room, Bayesian segmentation relies on a generative model of image appearance. So the idea is to say, well, I have a forward model that goes from a segmentation to an image. That model is relatively simple. It's generally a Gaussian mixture model, conditioned on the labels, and that's why it looks like speckly, like Gaussian noise. And normally you combine that with a model of artifacts like bias field, noise, and so forth. And now at test time, at inference, you are just saying like, well, if you give me an image and also a probabilistic atlas, but let's forget the atlas for now. If you give me an image, you're saying, well, according to my model, what's the most likely segmentation that generated this image? So you are inverting, so to speak, the model base rule. And the beauty of it is that the parameters of the Gaussian mixture model, so the means and the variances, are learned directly from the test scan. So I learned directly like, oh, the white matter is white, the gray matter is gray, and the CSF is black, and I can segment the image. But if you gave me a T2, it still works, because the inference method will recognize that in this case, the CSF is bright, the white matter is darker, and the gray matter is gray. So it's very powerful in that sense. And now you could say, well, what about partial voluming? And you'd be totally right, because that's the main problem with Bayesian segmentation. Actually, for the generative modeling, it's pretty straightforward. Like you can take the same model, you add an extra step, just like blur accordingly, simulate your partial volume, and it's actually pretty realistic. And if you take an image that has partial voluming, in principle, you can write down your equations. It's actually surprisingly easy. It's very similar to the original model. But the problem is that when you implement the inference method on a computer, it would take the age of the universe to run. And I mean, there's some tricks, so it's not the age of the universe, but it's super impractical. And the reason for it is actually that if we go back to the same figure as before, if you think of a supervoxel like this one, which is 1 by 1 by 7 millimeters, right? If you want to do inference with partial voluming and compute a segmentation that has like 7 subvoxels, when you compute the likelihood, you have to marginalize over all the possible internal configurations of the supervoxel that gave rise to the intensity that you observe. And that's exponentially hard, right? So taking a step back, comparing these CNNs with Bayesian segmentation, supervised CNNs, I mean, they're great, right? They're fast. When on the training domain, they're like essentially unbeatable, right? But they suffer from this domain gap problem. Bayesian segmentation, on the other hand, they have a good forward model. They're adaptive to contrast, which is great. The partial volume model is actually pretty realistic in the sense like the synthetic images look like real images, but it's slow or directly intractable in the presence of partial voluming. So what are we going to do about it, right? You probably see where this is coming already from the previous slide. But the idea is like, well, can we use this generative model from Bayesian segmentation that has been so successful in brain imaging for 2 decades? 2 decades, maybe 1.5. And can we use it to train one CNN, just one, with synthetic data that will swallow anything we throw at it and give us like 1 millimeter isotropic segmentations, right? Yeah. And the answer is that you can actually do this with synthetic data, essentially by randomizing the resolution and the contrast. So the idea is that you start from a training data set of 3D segmentations. So no images, just segmentations. And then what you do is to say from these guys, I'm going to generate pairs of synthetic images and corresponding segmentations and feed them to my 3D CNN for training, a 3D unit in most cases. There is a bunch of papers that my former PhD student, Benjamin Billo, published. The technique is called SynthSeg, and we did a great job milking it, as you can tell from the from the papers we published around it. So let's look into this a bit more slowly. Let's say that I want to synthesize a fake sagittal T1, right? So I start from a 3D segmentation from a label map. I deform it, right, which is pretty standard spatial augmentation. You sample this Gaussian mixture model. So here we have like crafted the means and the variances so that the image looks like a T1 scan. That's not the case in practice. It's just to illustrate the generative process. The next step would be simulating some bias field to make the image more realistic. Next, the partial volume model to simulate the sagittal acquisition. And then for convenience, what we do is that we upscale the image to 1 by 1 by 1. So we resample it so that it lives in the same voxel grid as the segmentation, right? So now, there you go. We have like an image segmentation pair that we can use for training a network. Now, in practice, what we do is random generation. So we start from the segmentation, we randomly deform it, but now we sample the Gaussian mixture model with random parameters, right? Like random means, random variances. So does this look like a real brain? Absolutely not. Bias field, same as before, partial volume model, and this is where like we also randomize the resolution. So every once in a while it's isotropic, every once in a while it's sagittal, every once in a while axial, sometimes coronal, right? And the resolution, the slice thickness, the slice spacing is also random. And then same as before, we resample to 1 by 1 by 1, and we have our image segmentation pair. So if you look at the generated scans, they mostly look like, they look terrible. They don't look like real brains. Every once in a while, yeah, they kind of do. This looks a bit like a T1. I mean, if you pay attention, it really doesn't. Like the right ventricle looks, different color as the left one and so forth. But sometimes they look semi-realistic. Most times they do not, right? To make the networks more robust, we also use different versions of the 3D segmentations of the training data. We have the full version with all the labels. Every once in a while, we drop the skull. Sometimes we keep the extracerebral CSF. And this is useful when you want to segment skull strip data or also ex vivo brains, which at the Martinos Center we do all the time. We work with ex vivo data quite a lot. We also use another version that has white matter lesions, which makes the method more robust. And the other thing is that in terms of like morphological variability, in the beginning, we were training SynthSeg only with this data set of 40 scans, 40, that were used to build the atlas in FreeSurfer at the Martinos. But then what we realized is that because you don't use the images, right? It actually makes sense to use automated segmentations from other datasets. So you can take FreeSurfer, run it on HCP. So this subject on the left is from the Human Connectome project. So a bunch of like pretty young subjects, which you can tell from the small ventricles. The one on the right is from ADNI, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. So that's why you see these massive ventricles here. And even if the FreeSurfer segmentations of these scans are not perfect, it doesn't matter, right? Because you're throwing away the images. Like essentially the images that you're using for training are generated from the segmentations, and therefore they're perfectly aligned by construction, which is an advantage, right? If you were to use like these segmentations with the original T1s, there'd be some mistakes, and the mistakes would hurt you. But here they don't. I mean, unless the segmentation is really, 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 really off, and you have like, I don't know, a hippocampus split in two or something. So this makes SynthSeg much more robust. So training is actually pretty straightforward. Like once you have the generator, at every mini batch, you draw randomly one label map, push it through your generative model, get your image, get your target labels, push it through your 3D unit. If you want to train with, unit R or some swing unit, it wouldn't change anything. Give you a prediction, compare with your favorite loss, normally dice, cross entropy, or a mix of both, and backprop. And that's it. The training is pretty straightforward. Could you squeeze in, I don't know, maybe get 2-3 more dice points by working a bit harder on this? Probably. At test time, we start by resampling to 1 by 1 by 1. Again, because this is how we train the network. Push it through the 3D unit, and you get a 1 by 1 by 1 prediction. So no matter what the original resolution of the test scan is, you always get a 1 millimeter isotropic prediction. We also do test time augmentation by left-right flipping. Processed, of course, you have to flip back the predictions, rearrange the channels, and take the average, right? And that gives you the segmentation. The left-right flipping, it buys you a bit of performance, but also it buys you the peace of mind, or at least it buys me the peace of mind of knowing that my algorithm is symmetric, rather than, because the brain is not symmetric, right? Like in principle, your network could learn that the left hemisphere is slightly different to the right. But on the other hand, if I find asymmetry on a data set, I'd rather that it stems from the data than from my neural network or my atlas. So like I said, I sleep better at night processing data this way. So let me show you some results. We have a bunch of training and testing data sets. It's a bit overwhelming, but hopefully I'll walk through the graphs slowly enough that it's not a problem. For training, we used half of that data set that I mentioned earlier that was manually labeled to build the atlas in FreeSurfer. We call it T139 because we had 39 scans, and we used 20 of those for training, and we leave some of them for testing. And this will allow us to see like how we do compare with a supervised network in exactly the same domain, right? We also train on the 500 scans from HCP, like I said earlier. That gives us like more variability in younger people, and then 500 from ADNI, more variability on older people. For testing, we have a bunch of like 1 millimeter isotropic datasets. There is this FSM FreeSurfer maintenance dataset that has 15 cases. It's not a lot, but the nice thing is that we have T1s, T2s, and these DBS sequences. So you can see how things work for different contrasts. We also have this data set that our collaborator Adrian Dalka and Mert Sabunji put together a long time ago, where they downloaded every public data set available, called the T1 mix. So it's a bunch of like 1 millimeter T1s from all over the internet. So this allows you to see what happens when you have T1s that are not exactly like the T1s that you use for training. We also have this pretty multispectral data set, which is small, but it's nice, with T1 sample density scans. They're skull stripped, they're manually labeled, which is nice. And then we also used a bunch of like almost 2,400 flares from ADNI. These are from ADNI 1, ADNI 2, and ADNI Go. In ADNI 3, they switched to 1 millimeter isotropic, but the first 3 iterations of ADNI, they had 5 millimeter axial scans. So that allows us to see how well we do on scans that are not isotropic. And the beauty of it is that we have matching 1 millimeter T1s. So by T1s I mean isotropic. So you can segment those with FreeSurfer and then use them as ground truth for the flare scans, which is nice. And we also found a bunch of, it's not a lot, we found a bunch of CT scans, a handful, that are 3 millimeter axial and also have the corresponding 1 millimeter isotropic T1s. So we can play the same games where we segment the T1, use it as ground truth for the CT. So I know it's a bit overwhelming in terms of data sets, but here's the story. So if you train on T149, right, supervised, so using the actual images, you train your T1 network, then what happens is that when you test on the same data set, the results are amazing, right? Like a 3D CNN, and by the way, we augmented a lot here. It's not like we didn't bother, like, no, we really tried to make, the most robust augmentation possible. So when you test in the same data set, results are amazing. They approach intra-rater variability, right? Over 90% dice. And when you look at other T1 weighted data sets at 1 millimeter, you lose some performance. There's a bit of a domain gap. It's not terrible, but you lose a bit of performance, right? The other modalities, you cannot even segment. It will blow up right away, right? So nothing there. Now, when you try test time adaptation, so the algorithm that we described earlier, it doesn't mess up the within domain, which is good. For the other T1 datasets, hey, it buys you a couple of points. That's not bad. It puts you above 85% for every dataset, which is kind of cool. And when you look at the other contrasts and the other resolutions, it does a good job for some of them, especially for the ones that are 1 millimeter isotropic, but it really struggles with the resolution difference. We also tried SAMSEG, which is our Bayesian segmentation method. And SAMSEG essentially gives you like a pretty good performance across the board when the images are 1 millimeter isotropic. It stays over 80% dice in all cases. And hey, for not being a neural network, this is pretty good. But like we said earlier, it struggles with the resolution, with partial voluming. And when you look at SynSeg, it's like, okay, yeah, you lose in this domain, right? Like you don't have access to the real intensities. You're gonna lose 3 or 4 dice. It's still like 87% dice, which is pretty good. But the nice thing is that you don't lose as much performance, or actually you don't lose performance at all in the 1 millimeter data sets, right? Because again, you're training with fake intensities, so you don't care if it's a T1, a T2, or a proton density scan. And even for the lower resolution, you still do a pretty decent job. I mean, considering for example, that the flares are like 5 millimeter axial, approaching 80% dice is pretty nice. The dice is computed not on the slices; it's computed at 1 millimeter isotropic, just to be clear. And the same thing for the CT scan, which being a freaking CT is actually pretty good. That we can actually segment it at 75% dice. And then the other thing is like, I'm presenting you the results in the opposite order in which we generated them. But the story was like, hey, what happens if you train SynSeg with the resolution? Like if you target the simulation so that the resolution that you simulate is that of the target dataset. So we trained 3 different SynSegs here, like one with 1 millimeter images, another one with 5 millimeter axial, and another one for 3 millimeter axial, and then tested with those, right? So these targeted simulations actually lead to a little decrease in performance. And if you play the same thing, you play the same game with the contrast, you see the same effect. So I guess the lesson here is that because the whole spirit of the technique is, let's simulate like a wide, like massively wide variability of appearances such that real scans are just like in the middle of this ocean of simulations, right? So if you make that ocean a bit smaller, you essentially lose performance, right? Because you lose this generalization ability. So maybe I don't know, maybe it's not counterintuitive. In the beginning, it was a bit counterintuitive to us, but not anymore. I'm going to show you some segmentations. Long story short is that with T1s, this is the ground truth. Everything works, right? Upstairs is a scan from within domain. This from T1 mix, and the baseline is amazing. Test time adaptation works really well. SAMSEG does a good job too. Like you can barely tell the differences. Maybe SAMSEG makes some little mistake here and there, but I mean it's pretty good too. And SynSeg too. SynSeg works, which is, I don't know, the first time we saw it work is like, this is quite something. You're training with cartoons and it works on real images, right? But when you start looking at the different contrasts, the different resolutions, this is where like things start changing, right? So this is the ground truth for one of the DBS scans and one of the flares from ADNI. And test time adaptation starts like having problems, right? Like it's missing half of the visual cortex in the FSM, in the DBS scan upstairs. here like is having a lot of problems with the cortex as well. The amygdala is also like over-segmented. The resolution seems to be a big problem for TTA in general. Same thing for SAMSEG. Actually, SAMSEG upstairs for the FSM is not bad. Some small mistakes here and there, but being 1 millimeter isotropic, it copes with it. But when you start going down in resolution, for example, here, like you're missing half the pallidum, which is the globus pallidus in blue here. Or like, if you pay attention, if you remember the example I was showing you earlier, where the white matter and the CSF mix into gray voxels, it also makes these mistakes, right? And SYNTSEG is by no means perfect, but it does a pretty sweet job, I think, like recovering, especially if you look at the axial one, recovering the CRISPR details at 1 millimeter resolution. I mean, of course, it's not as sharp as it would be with a 1 by 1 by 1 scan, like the one upstairs, but it's still pretty sharp. So when we had SYNTSEG up and running, the next step was like, okay, let's use it to run neuroimaging studies, right? But then we realized that we still were missing a bunch of components to run a study like in the wild with data like straight from the packs. One was that we still need a bit more of robustness. Like SYNTSEG every once in a while will blow up, especially with, for example, like limited fields of view, which happens all the time in clinical imaging. Also, we realized like we were like silly enough not to have like a way of computing the intracranial volume, which is the single most important covariate in volumetry. So if my head is twice as big as yours, my hippocampus is expected to be twice as big, right? If you don't account for that, you have a big confounding factor there. And going back to the robustness, we're like, okay, we're going to miss every once in a while. This is going to happen, or the field of view is going to be tiny. So we need an automated QC method in order to be able to throw away segmentation failures. And the other missing bit was cortical parcellation. So in a follow-up paper, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but like it's essentially a pipeline that solves all these problems. It came out earlier this year in PNAS. And the idea is that instead of starting with going from the input to our 36 labels, we first go to 4. So we do tissue classes with a first segmenter. Then we use the same denoiser that was conveniently repurposed from the TTA pre-implementation that Benjamin put together. And that denoiser essentially fixes mistakes. Like, for example, like, hey, down here, you are saying that the cerebellum gray matter, it's like cerebral gray matter. So the denoiser does a great job fixing that. And then you compute the segmentation into 36 labels, combining the original input and the denoised tissue classes. So when you condition on this segmentation here, which is super robust because it's gone through the denoiser, that makes the two-step procedure like super robust, like much more so than the original SYNTSEG. It also looks a little bit smoother, I must admit. For the cortex, it looks a bit smoother, but like other than that, it's much better. And then from this segmentation, we have 2 additional heads. One of them subdivides into the cortex into cortical parcels. So doing it in 2 stages like this allows us not to struggle with memory, right? Because otherwise you have like 100 and something labels, and the final layer of your unit uses too much memory. And we also have an additional head, which is a regressor that predicts the so-called QC scores, which is essentially the dice overlap of the label at hand. So you're trying to predict dice from the segmentation. And the regressor is actually pretty good at picking up, I mean, as you can imagine, right? Like, for example, like partial field of view or limited field of view, like it picks it up right away. Big segmentation failures, they get picked up right away. Every once in a while, like, you have a false negative, but it's a small price to pay for cleaning up your data like very effectively. The numbers are in the paper. It's actually, the regressor is pretty good. So just to illustrate it, we ran this on a study of aging using 14,000 clinical scans like straight from the packs at MGH. So every acquisition in there, we don't know if they are T1s, T2s, if they are MR angiography, diffusion, or sometimes instead of a brain, you maybe have a knee because there is a problem with the Dykman header. So it's really, really dirty data. And this is what we got. And I don't know if you've ever looked into these curves, but it's exactly what you would expect. Like you see the cortex going down from this. By the way, these are really depressing. The cortex going down since like very early in your life. We start at 18 years old. The white matter stays fit a bit longer and starts going down a bit later. This is like the textbook quadratic growth of the lateral ventricles. The basal ganglia goes down, the thalamus goes down from the start, again, really depressing. The amygdala and the hippocampus, they resist a bit longer. I am about here right now, which is also kind of depressing, the beginning of the end. So we compared this with a study by Pierrick Coupet and collaborators that used T1 weighted 1 millimeter isotropic scans. And we're very happy to see that essentially we're getting the same results. As you can tell, Benjamin got the inspiration from their figure. That's why the two figures are so similar. And let me please block like blatantly the first 18 years of life from their figure. And you can see exactly that we're getting exactly the same pretty much, right? Like I said, the white matter lasts a bit longer, gray matter goes down from the beginning. This is the quadratic curve for the CSF. Basal ganglia, thalamus going down, hippocampus and amygdala lasting a bit longer. So we were very happy to see this. I know we spent a lot of time on segmentation because we're going over the methods. So actually going over super resolution and synthesis is going to be much faster because the methods are pretty much the same. So the thing with this method that we call SynthesR is that I would like to believe that there is more to life than segmentation. So, and particularly segmentation with FreeSurfer. Maybe you're like, hey, I want to segment, I don't know, with FSL, or I don't want to segment, I want to register stuff. I don't know. And the thing is, like, there is plenty of neuroimaging tools to run this analysis, right? But they're mostly designed to work with 1 millimeter isotropic scans. And sometimes, like FreeSurfer, that acquisition or FSL has to be actually T1 weighted. For other packages, it doesn't. So now the question is like, hey, can we generate a 1 millimeter isotropic T1 weighted scan, a 1 millimeter MP range from any clinical scan, right? Because then you can do whatever the heck you want, not only segmentation. So as you can imagine, yes, we are playing the same games as with SynthSeg. It's the same strategy. So the idea with SynthesR is that, and this is the biggest difference, is that you need not only the segmentations for training, but you also need the corresponding 1 millimeter MP ranges, which, I mean, makes sense. You need a target, right? So your generator is the same, it's identical, with the only difference that in addition to warping the labels, you also, like especially augmenting the labels, you also warp the 1 millimeter isotropic MP ranges, right? And this is the synthetic scan that is going to be the input to your network. So it's like, random contrast and random resolution. So the idea is that you take that scan, you push it through your unit. In this case, you have a linear layer at the end because you're predicting intensities, not labels. So that will give you a prediction, right? That will be more or less accurate. And then you can compare your prediction with your ground truth MPRH, have an intensity loss. Typically like L1 works pretty well. And you're done, right? Sort of. You can do this. And then what happens is that the L1 loss doesn't always penalize the features you're interested in. So I don't know if you guys are familiar, but like with the claustrum, which is this very thin layer of gray matter between the basal ganglia, the putamen, and the cortex, and it often leads to mixed segmentations like this. Like there should be like the putamen in pink and the cortex here in red. They shouldn't be touching each other, right? And the reason for it is that for the network, it's very cheap in terms of L1 norm, just to say, hey, that's a tough area. Let's just blur it and that's it. So in order to fix that, what we did was to say, well, how about you take a segmentation unit trained on 1 millimeter T1s, you freeze it, right? And then during training of SynthesR, you take the predicted intensities, you push them through the unit, which gives you segmentation, and now you compare with the original labels, right? So now, if you blur those features and the segmentation is wrong, you will pay a price. You will pay a higher price than you would with L1. So this is the before and after when you add that segmentation unit. So you can see that the prediction is much crisper. We also played used the same tricks to build tolerance to pathology of adding like fake white matter lesions like these ones here. And qualitatively, it looks pretty nice. So these are like 3 inputs with 3 different orientations, resolutions, and contrast. Upstairs is a turbospin echo T1 sagittal. This is an axial T2 and a coronal flare. And this is what SynthesR looks like. So it's giving you these pretty 1 millimeter isotropic images, no matter what you throw in. You can segment them with FreeSurfer and get segmentations like this. You can get like your cortical reconstructions with your parcellations and so forth. The first thing we did was preparing the aging study. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but we got the same results, which is good. We were happy about that. And then to keep looking into volumetry, but other packages, what we did was to use FSL. So we used the ADNI because we have the T1s that are 1 millimeter isotropic, and they are our silver standard, and we have the flares. So this is your axial flare. You can push it through SynthesR and get this fake 1 millimeter T1. That one you can analyze with FSL and get your segmentations that look like this. And then you can use FSL on the T1s, on the real T1s, and use them as ground truth, right? So when you look at the correlation here between the volume from the T1 and the volume from the flare, again, this is the hippocampus, right? The hippocampus is sort of parallel to the axial plane. So using like a 5 millimeter axial acquisition to measure hippocampal volume, I mean, it's incredibly hard. So it's not surprising that because of blurring, the volume estimates are a bit higher in general. But the correlation is pretty good. It's 83%. And the separation between the Alzheimer's and the controls is still there. So if you run a non-parametric test, you see like, well, the medians are, again, a bit higher, but the separation is, you lose a little bit, right? The area under the curve goes from 81 to 76. But again, it's a 5 millimeter axial flare, so we were very happy with this. Something else you can do with SynthesR is registration. So this is from the BRADS-REG dataset. So this is like pre-op and follow-up scans of patients with gliomas. So these are the 2 scans. And if you were to register them directly, it'd be a disaster, right? Like we used a nifty reg in this case. And the registration is trying to align the hyperintense regions, and it gives you a field that is way too convoluted, right? It goes nuts. This is what the deformed image looks like. And yeah, sure, it's making this guy or the hyperintense region look like the one here, but it's like creating like all this completely unrealistic deformation of the tissue, right? This is using nifty reg default parameters. Now, if you use SynthesR, you get like a triple benefit. Like 1, you lose deletion. 2, you win resolution. So partial voluming doesn't mess up the registration as much anymore. And 3, the contrast is standardized because you're always synthesizing like this canonical MP-Rage contrast, which is the MP-Rage contrast of your training data set. So now you can register these 2 guys to each other and get a much nicer deformation field that, of course, you can apply to the original scan. So now you can compare this guy here with this guy over here, voxel by voxel, much more accurately. We did this as well with the Atlas dataset, which is this public dataset of chronic stroke. So if you give me these images, I can wipe the stroke essentially. I can segment it with FreeSurfer, or I can build atlases. So this is what I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer, but like this is what the atlas looks like. This is the distribution of the stroke lesions. There is much more on the right hemisphere than on the left, and I always wonder if this is like confounded by the fact that if a person has a stroke on the left hemisphere, which is where Broca's area is, and language is affected, maybe they're less likely to enroll in a study like that. I don't know. We play the same games with brats too. So you can take the brain brats. It's the brain tumor segmentation dataset, and you can build atlases that look like these guys over here using only images like the ones on the left, right? So if you take SynthesR, take these guys, go register everything using the fake 1 millimeter scans, you get really good registrations. And then all you need to do is to throw the intensities under the tumors, which you can do because you have the labels, and you can get like very pretty atlases despite the ugly inputs. And you can, again, compute probabilistic maps for the different tumor regions, like the necrotic, enhancing, and the edema in the center, right? You have kind of like the same trend as before. Again, I never know if it's because of this Broca's area thing. And just to wrap up, I'm going to show you a bit of work in progress about portable MRI and surface placement. I don't know how many of you have seen the hyperfine swoop scanner. It has a permanent magnet, so 64 millitesla, which is, you know, a fridge magnet is somewhere between 5 and 10. So it's like 10 times stronger than your I Love Paris or I Love New York fridge magnet. Yeah, no helium, no cooling. You can just like plug it on the wall. You can be around it with any equipment that you like, your laptop, your phone, medical equipment, because the field is so low. It is pretty affordable, or it should be. It costs about 20 grand to make. Unfortunately, it doesn't cost 20K to buy, but the potential for being cheap is there. And it has a lot of potential in underserved areas. So if you think of like low middle income countries or rural areas, and also in more like first world scenarios, if you think of critical care of stroke, you can do point of care imaging, right? Like bring the scanner to the patient instead of the patient to the scanner. But in terms of image quality, you get what you pay for, right? You have 64 millitesla, so that limits the SNR quite a lot. So, well, if you look at the stock sequences of that come with the scanner, resolution is pretty low, so you have a decent SNR. They're 1.6 millimeter in plane, 5 millimeter spacing. If you play with the advanced mode, you can go isotropic up to 2.5, 3 millimeters. More than that, like scanning times approach 20 minutes, and it's a bit too much. So nowadays stops you from doing supervised super resolution in principle, but the problem is that the domain gap is a killer, because like Hyperfine is really good at rolling out updates. So they will like update your firmware every 2 weeks, and that will like change the image contrast. So if you want something robust, so let's do SynthesR, right? Because then you don't have to worry about these changes. And it turned out that SynthesR didn't work at first. So we had to come up with a slightly more dedicated model of resolution and signal loss. But actually, it does a very good job. The details are in the paper, but essentially, the volumes given by FreeSurfer on the SynthesR of the low field are very well correlated with the ground truth derived from high field scans from the same subjects. So this is going through coronal slices of the T2 hyperfine on the left, the SynthesR in the middle, and the FreeSurfer output on the right. The final thing I wanted to cover, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'll rush a little bit, is surface placement. We had the same problem as before. We're like, okay, when you do SynthesR, yes, sure, you can run SynthesR and FreeSurfer, but same as before, like your L1 and your dice overlaps, they don't directly penalize the features that determine the cortical thickness, because blurring the cortex can be a bit cheap, both for L1 and for dice, right? So again, if you want to look at, say, cortical thickness, this becomes problematic. So our postdoc, Kartik Gopinath, just presented his work at MICAI, where he was essentially playing the synth game one more time, but this time looking to regress sign distance functions for the left and right PL and white matter surfaces. So the ground truth, the training data now, you have your segmentations that you use to generate fake images and your SDFs. And then you essentially learn to regress the real SDFs, which are isotropic, from the low resolution synthetic scans, such that at test time, you have let's say, one of these like axial flares from ADNI, and your CNN will estimate like 1 millimeter isotropic sign distance functions for all the surfaces. And the nice thing about doing things this way is that once you have these SDFs, you can directly take advantage of all the geometry processing that we already have in FreeSurfer to do the surface reconstruction and further processing like cortical thickness, parcellation, and all the other stuff that is on FreeSurfer already. So qualitatively, the surfaces look pretty nice and pretty compelling. Of course, the lower the resolution of the input data, the smoother the surfaces look. The white matter surface, which is where the parcellations are computed, is definitely more than good enough to parcellate really well. The PL surface, which is trickier, right? Because it's closer to self-intersecting. It can look a bit smooth sometimes, depending on the resolution of the input. And again, I'm running out of time, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on this. But again, the take-home lesson is that these surfaces are pretty darn good for parcellating. Like the die scores of the parcellations are very high. But if you're looking into cortical thickness, we are not there yet. Like there's like some false negatives that we don't like, some false positives that we don't like this one here. But it's still much better than using Synthesar and FreeSurfer directly. So we are hoping to get there sometime soon. And just to wrap up, we have these methods that can process these scans of any contrast, any resolution, no retraining. It works out of the box. You download FreeSurfer, you press the button, and it just works. If you want to train your own synthseg, you only need segmentations, which is nice. For Synthesar, you do need the images, but I have an asterisk peak, so I need more evidence about this. But I think that the segmentations may be a bit inaccurate, and still you may be able to get away with it. Maybe next time we talk. Again, they can adapt to different levels of pre-processing and be super robust. And like I said earlier, augmenting beyond what seems realistic is actually normally a good idea. And maybe this is, again, obvious, but it wasn't for us in the beginning. And in terms of future work, we are currently working on unifying the models, so it's faster and hopefully more robust and more accurate. Like I said, improving the surfaces to get better accuracy because the thickness is not there yet. And a bit more boring, but we should probably also do it, is exploring other more modern architectures, right? And crucially, probably the most important thing, trying to model pathology a bit better. And anything else you come up with. And yeah, I'm gonna close acknowledging funding bodies and my wonderful co-authors, especially Benjamin Villa, who's the PhD student who drove this work. He has spearheaded the whole thing. And yeah, here are the links to the FreeSurfer wiki for the different pipelines. I don't think we can make them any easier to run. Like, synthseg input output, Synthesar input output, minus low field if you have a hyperfine scan. Reconol clinical input subject. They run in 10 seconds. Not Reconol clinical. Reconol clinical is the one that does the surfaces, so that takes a bit longer. But the other two work really, really fast. And yeah, if you have any questions, you can email me at any of these addresses. And yeah, sorry, especially Sean. Sorry, I went a bit over time.
All right, well, let's have some time for questions. We can just go to coffee a bit later than scheduled, right? So any questions from the audience? Ask away. Yes.
Thanks for that, Juan.
Eugenio.
Awesome.
Fine.
That was a really, the tools you presented are really, really nice, extremely useful. And we see, for example, when we collect data from the hospital, we see a lot of annotation issues. So having this this tool that can image, segment any of these images is very useful. I just keep coming back from the point of view of sort of application. is this validation aspect, especially for localized pathologies. And just as more like an open question, is sort of the way that we would validate these approaches, is it still the standard approach of collecting a data set that is specific to the pathology of interest, and then collecting ground truth data for that, and then testing these approaches? Is that sort of, is that, I guess, how you see this working in the future?
Yeah, absolutely, right. And this is harder, easier or harder depending on the pathology. If you think of, for example, well, white matter lesions, right? It's relatively easy compared with, say, acute stroke, to get someone scanned at 1 millimeter isotropic resolution, right, and collecting ground truth. So for some pathology, but you have to, right? I mean, ultimately, it's the only way of knowing 100% sure that you're getting the result that you want. So I foresee that for some pathologies like acute stroke, it's gonna be tricky, and we'll have to rely more on indirect measurements and indirect validation. Like, for example, ability of prognosis, right? Like, is your automated segmentation or your automated quantification of this stroke well correlated with what happens to this person in the future, right? Whereas with, again, if you look at multiple sclerosis, for example, or white matter lesions, it may be easier to say like, well, no, I actually have a 1 millimeter isotropic flare where like someone manually traced all these lesions, and like I know that my low field image is giving me measurements that are very, very well correlated, right? So yeah, we'll see, but definitely modeling pathology is high up on the list.
And sorry, just one quick follow-up to that. That all makes really good sense, especially for the prognosis, or like how you described that. One thing I'm wondering though is that in order to identify, one way you could sort of apply this is you access all the data in the EHR, and if you want, for example, to find cases that have got specific pathologies, and then manually sort of pull out ground truth data from that. I'm just wondering, would the alternative pathway be, because in some instances, I'm hoping most instances, there's some sort of standardization to the protocol that's applied for a certain pathology. I'm just wondering if, because of that case, would going with a classification of what type of image it is, and then creating a specialized segmentation tool, training a specific segmentation model for that, would that sort of potentially provide better results than trying to have something that segments everything? Just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, no, it could be. I guess it depends too on how clean or dirty your data turns out to be, right? Because if you want to do it at scale, it has to be automated. Like, okay, maybe you can manually check. Yeah, I don't know, because I mean the beauty of it is the ability to extract like trillions, not trillions, but like zillions of scans from your packs, and then you have to go through the EHRs automatically, ideally, right? Even though you can have some manual QC, I agree with that. But even then, I would be a bit afraid of the variability. It's not really standardized, not even within hospitals, right? Or maybe smaller hospitals, they do, I don't know, smaller clinics. But at MGH, it's like every single study is different. Like, it's insane, like how different studies are from each other. It's almost like everyone is an outlier of its own. There are some trends. For example, at MGH, you can tell, like looking at images, that there were like a bunch of years for which acquiring a 7 millimeter sagittal T1 with turbospin echo was pretty standard. And then they appeared, and then they disappeared. And but people who have those, sometimes they have another one, sometimes they don't. I don't know. It's hard, but it's a fun problem. So I wish I had an answer for your question, but I don't.
Thank you.
Great talk, Juan. I have a question about when you use super resolution and do the segmentations and then you project back, I think there is always this issue on the amount of uncertainty of you having that back projection, because now you have more partial volumes naturally. Do you have any thoughts on how that can be improved, or if there is a way of propagating uncertainty due to this increasing partial volume for different segmentations? I'm thinking this in, usually you see people using these tools and fully 100% relying on the volume that you get from the segmentation and try to report that. But if you change the resolution, that should comes with a plus minus this much amount of volume because you are in a different resolution.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think here we have to separate two very different scenarios, right? So if you're telling me like, hey, I'm going to give you 10,000 scans, can you build normative trajectories? Then I probably don't care about error bars, right? They're going to get washed away anyway. If you tell me, like Eugenio Iglesias, like, hey, we want to make a life or death decision based on your n equal to 1, I do want the error bars, right? Like, then error bars are very important. And of course, yeah, so the way this is set up is that uncertainty quantification was aim 3 on the grant, and we'll start working on it hopefully sooner than later. We have 2 new postdocs that started recently. One of well, 2 of them are very interested on this problem. For the time being, we have a simple head where, like, instead of predicting just an intensity, you predict a distribution, like a Gaussian distribution, you predict a mean and you predict a variance. Or in the L1 sense, you predict a median and you predict the scale of the Laplace distribution. So that gives you, it gives you a heat map, but it's very basic. We really need to do a better job with uncertainty quantification. And as you know, it's a tough problem. People like drop out at test time because it's simple and it's easy to implement and it gives you something. But I think we need to do much better than that. So if you have me over again in 2-3 years, maybe we can have more results on this, especially for pathology, right? Like, I think, like, okay, the partial volume in between the lateral ventricle and the white matter I can live with. Like, whether this is a tumor or a white matter lesion or not, that's a completely different game. So yeah, no, thanks for the, yeah, it's a very good comment.
Well, any other questions before we wrap up? Yeah. All right, so let's thank Eugenio again, and I'll see you back in Boston, Eugenio.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And sorry for standing between you guys and coffee.